Hello, it's me, Recky. Welcome back for another military reaction. With me, Recky. I came across this video when browsing for something cool to watch when it comes to military, and it caught my attention. This is from a channel called Task and Purpose. If you want to check it out, link for the video and of course for the channel Task and Purpose, you find both of them in the description. Go there and give them the support that they so much deserve. This video caught my eye quite a lot due to the fact that the title is very interesting. U.S. Army strikes on Mexican cartels is worse than you think. I know that Mexico probably has a lot of issues with the cartels, and I really don't understand why U.S. Army would go in there and do something about it. So hopefully we're going to find out. If you do enjoy this, I want you to smack the like and of course hit that subscribe. I would greatly appreciate that. Small things, especially liking the video if you do enjoy. Small things, but a lot for me. So consider it. And of course, a big thank you to the channel members and the Patreon. Thank you so much for the incredible support. Shout out to the Supreme Tier donators, Patreon, and of course channel membership. Thank you so much. Incredible. Thank you. Personal shoutouts to the ultimate supporters: Deja, Walt, Roni, Dwayne, Tammy, Kevin, Dana, Troy, Sarah, and Robert. Long list. Thank you. Cool people. I appreciate you. Now, let's find out why the U.S. Army is striking on the Mexican cartels.
Is the U.S. government really calling for legislation to invade Mexico and destroy the drug cartels? So here's what happened. On March 7, 2023, 2 American tourists were killed by the cartel while visiting Mexico. In response, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham announced his plan to introduce a bill that would lay the groundwork for authorizing the use of U.S. military force against Mexican drug cartels. A major step, as the Pentagon typically just advises and assists with anti-drug operations. Historically, they've never authorized.
One thing I love about this, if this was Sweden, I went to Norway and I got killed by the Norwegian cartel, the Swedish government won't do crap about it. I'm sorry to hear that. We're going to open up some churches for you guys to go and mourn. What that crap does to the U.S. All right, let's invade Mexico. Not, you know what I mean.
Direct strikes against cartels inside of Mexico. But this new bill would bestow upon the Mexican cartels the unique honor of becoming one of only 65 foreign terrorist organizations in the entire world. This FTO designation would have many consequences, right? Among them, it would authorize the use of U.S. military-targeted drone strikes with AGM Hellfire missiles, nighttime American Special Forces surgical raids on cartel leaders as they try to sleep, satellite intelligence assets
as they try to sleep
focused on the southern border. Supporters say that this will give the U.S. government more powerful, lethal tools to destroy the cartel. Critics claim it could ruin a relationship with an important strategic ally, Mexico. Declarations like this are controversial and have understandably alarmed the Mexican government. It's called into question the correct role of the U.S. military in counter-narcotics. From Mexico's perspective, it's easy to see how they might not see the distinction between a targeted missile strike on a drug lab and a full-blown invasion. However, this is far from the first time the idea of using U.S. military force directly against Mexican cartels has been floated. In 2019, an attack by cartel members ended in 9 U.S. citizens killed and 5 others injured in Mexico, inside an area just south of Arizona, where rival cartels are still at war with each other. These cartel groups are fighting to secure smuggling routes close to the U.S. border, and this activity leads to mistaken identity, crossfire, and sometimes targeted attacks against innocent Americans. U.S. Texas Army National Guard soldiers on the border with Mexico have been shot at by machine guns and taunted by heavily armed cartel members across the Rio Grande. This has prompted the U.S. Embassy to issue safety warnings advising Americans against traveling to certain dangerous regions inside of Mexico. All of this led to 2019, when U.S. lawmakers said enough is enough, time to take off the gloves. We're labeling these cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And criticisms from the Mexican president Obrador to not do that. Why not, though? Anyone who would do these types of horrible crimes is obviously a terrorist, right? They are certainly terrorizing people, but it's not that simple. Designating cartels as FTOs would mean Mexico would instantly be considered.
I don't understand. Cartel FTOs. The only FTO I know is field training officer. I'm trying to figure out what that means.
A more risky country for foreign governments to invest money into, or to do business in, or even take a vacation. That's a big deal in a nation like Mexico, where tourism generates more than $20 billion in revenue a year and creates millions of jobs. Tourism accounts for about 8% of Mexico's total GDP. Cruise missiles striking drug labs a few kilometers away from where you're trying to enjoy spring break and have a couple of tequila sunshines really dampens the vibe.
It actually does. I mean, I wouldn't enjoy my tequila if there was a freaking Hawk missile landing right next to me. If I knew it was the Americans, I would pretty be stopped.
Michael Jenkins, who's a senior advisor to the RAND president, pointed out that American manufacturing and commercial operations in Mexico could also be disrupted by labeling cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Trade between the two countries totaled more than $750 billion in 2022. Nearly 5 million US jobs depend on that trade. The economic impact on Mexico could be catastrophic, which would generate more northbound refugees from Mexico and increase pressure on the southern border in the United States. The reason for this is because how would it look if you're doing business with a nation that has an active, legally defined terrorist organization inside of it? On the other hand, we need to put the full scope of the problem into perspective here, because those calling for increased intervention and FTO designation aren't doing it for no
FTO. Okay, so here it is, designation. So FTO is Foreign Terrorist Organization. I'm pretty sure you guys paused the video and wrote that already down for me. I appreciate that, so keep that coming, unless, sometimes they don't tell it. You guys can tell me in the comments. Foreign Terrorist Organization, completely new to me. Love it, love it, love it.
A reason. One of the major reasons might not be what you think it is, or maybe it is. It's China. Because the US government estimates 90% of fentanyl and fet precursor chemicals that travel through the Mexican cartels come from China. That's more than 50 million pills laced with fentanyl and 10,000 pounds of lethal substance. An estimated 106,000 Americans died from overdoses in 2021. There's even evidence China's purposely allowing the flow of fentanyl to the United States through Mexican cartels as a piece of leverage to hold over the United States. For instance, on August 5th, 2022, in response to the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the PRC's Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced the formal suspension of US-China cooperation in 5 areas, including counter-narcotics. This is China basically saying, if you don't do what we like, we can't help it if we accidentally send thousands of pounds of fat to your country.
Sorry.
Through the cartels in Mexico. Oops, sorry about all that fentanyl. So this is the justification for why some American lawmakers want to label cartels as FTOs, because from their point of view, the cartel is basically acting as an agent for the Chinese Communist Party's attempts to destabilize the US with fentanyl.
Rather than just interdicting at the border, we go to the source and declare Mexican drug cartels foreign terrorist organizations under U.S. law. Would you consider that?
Yes, we certainly consider that.
And that would help us with China, because if you provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization, you could be prosecuted in U.S. courts.
I'm not saying that the U.S. government should designate cartels foreign terrorist organizations. I'm explaining the rationalization, because whether you agree or disagree with it, it's important to understand the real reason behind why lawmakers are calling for it. Everyone wants these horrors to end. No one can agree on the correct way to end them. So, is there any solution where the US military can go weapons free on the cartels without needing to designate them as foreign terrorist organizations, which could negatively impact Mexico's prosperity? Well, possibly. In January 2023, former Navy SEAL and current Congressman Dan Crenshaw introduced legislation called the Authorization for Use of Military Force to Target Mexican Cartels, a more diplomatic approach potentially than the last one. Dan Crenshaw says the proposals will allow the United States military to work alongside their allies in the Mexican army to solve this problem, and that the point is not just to bomb Mexico. One way of looking at these reactions from the US government is that they create fear in the Mexican cartel and deter them from making these kind of mistakes where innocent Americans get killed and caught in the crossfire. What critics of designating cartels as foreign terrorist organizations often don't understand is this is not calling for an invasion of Mexico. And what supporters of designating cartels as FTOs don't understand is people.
This is a very, very tough question. I mean, for me as a Swede, it's kind of hard to, but if it happens to, let's pretend it's something like Sweden, Norway, or Sweden, Denmark, whatever. And I would probably not say that Sweden should go into Norway to fight crime in that sense, because I feel like that's something that Norway has to fix themselves, to be honest. I mean, Sweden has a pretty high crime rate. I think we have about 150, maybe even 200 more police officers per 100,000 citizens. So we have way more crime here than the neighbors of our geography have. And I don't know. I think it's a really tough case when it comes to U.S. going in and bombing Mexican cartels because they killed citizens of United States. I think it's really hard. What happens if, let's pretend that America goes to Cuba and it's the same thing there? I mean, there's already American soldiers in Cuba in that sense, but it could be any country. Would that be the same thing? I think it's a really hard nut to crack. I'm super eager to find out what you think. So flood that comment section, and I will try to read as many as I possibly can. I want to know: would you support the U.S. Army to go in and fight Mexican cartels, or not? And please state why on both yes or no.
People are expressing valid concerns about the US military's history of mission creep. It starts with a couple of targeted, specific missile strikes, and before you know it, we're involved in a horrific counterinsurgency mission in Mexico. But this claim that this is a call for the invasion of Mexico is instantly what the conversation became about in the mainstream media and on Twitter, where Ben Norton, geopolitical journalist, said the US is lobbying for an invasion of Mexico.
Why does his picture look like a GTA picture?
But Ben does make a great point in this post, that Mexico exports over $300 billion worth of computers, cars, and other important goods to the United States. Any unilateral military action against the cartels would ruin a relationship with one of America's greatest strategic allies and partners. But is the military the right tool for the problem? There's some personal drama I need to address real quick before we continue. So YouTube demonetized my last video because they mistakenly thought my John Wick parody sponsored by Goat Guns were for actual firing guns. I want to make it clear, Goat Guns do not fire. If you were one of the people who purchased a 1/3 scale collectible because you thought you'd use it for personal home defense, I'm sorry. I can only imagine how awkward it was when a robber broke into your home and you reached for your 16-ounce die-cast metal replica to no avail. I also noticed an order for 200,000 Goat Guns from the US Army and another 400,000 orders from North Korea. I'm assuming Biden and Kim Jong-un were also confused. Don't worry, the 90-day return policy also applies to armed forces anywhere in the world. Goat Guns are for display on your shelf, coffee table, or desk. They have a fine level of craftsmanship and attention to detail on the models. You can get
well, I don't know why I got so interested in this. I'm gonna check this out.
Your non-firing Goat Gun, if that's what you're looking for, by clicking the link in the description. They make the perfect Father's Day gift, so grab one today. And remember, YouTube and everybody, they don't actually fire. There is, of course, evidence.
Oh my God. Hopefully the link is in the description.
On both sides of the argument. And what does the US Department of Defense think about increasing their role in counter-narcotics? You might think they would be all about increasing their power, but it's actually the opposite. Since the 1980s, the Department of Defense representatives have stated the proper role of the military is to provide support, to civilian law enforcement agencies so they can make the arrests and seizures. The Pentagon has actively tried to minimize their role here. General Mark Milley said the following on the topic.
So there is a crisis at that border. Now, the question is, what do you do about it? We have to work much closer with Mexico. Could you line up divisions of troops? Of course you could. But is that the right thing to do? Is that the right way to do it? And I think the lead agency along the border itself should be the police.
But lining up divisions of troops on the border isn't what anyone's proposing, if we're being fair. Senator Graham stated the Narcos bill will give the military the authority to go after these organizations wherever they exist, not to invade Mexico, not to shoot Mexican airplanes down, but to destroy drug labs that are poisoning Americans. But this is kind of what happens. People misinterpret that to the more simplified, more clickbaity version of we should use the military to invade Mexico to end the cartels. However, you can understand why people might see it that way. Authorizing military strikes against a neighboring country of any kind is arguably an invasion and could quickly
I completely agree.
Escalate into conventional boots on the ground if the initial missile strikes do not produce the intended results, and cartel activity continues or violence increases. So I can understand why people are skeptical of military use of force solution. However, there's another issue that we need to fully think through here before we hit the big red button. The border between the United States and Mexico is 1,950 miles about, with 48 points of entry. The proposal here is to strike cartel targets along this border, but it's not as simple as we wish it to be. Cartels don't just set up drug operations in the middle of nowhere, waiting to be hit by an American missile strike. They're smarter than that. Cartels set up drug operations inside residential areas, houses, and apartment buildings where innocent civilians live. To complicate matters further, it's often innocent civilians held against their will who are manufacturing, packing, and transporting the drugs. Somehow, American missile strike against those drug facilities seems less palatable when I think about it like that. This would leave one real option then: boots on the ground. US Special Forces or even conventional forces going house to house, kicking in doors to kill or capture cartel members. And there's a lot of cartel members. In 2012, it was estimated that the Mexican cartels employed over 450,000 people.
Oh, what? No, is he talking about almost 500,000 employed cartel members? That is insane.
Directly, and a further 3.2 million people's livelihoods depend on various parts of the drug economy in Mexico. In a city such as Juarez, up to 60% of the economy depends on illegal sources of income. If all of this sounds familiar, it should. You even have the hot desert backdrop. It's like a combination of Iraq and Afghanistan, where US forces tried to end the poppy trade in Afghanistan, but found if you quickly remove the poppy trade without any kind of replacement for that void, you would destroy Afghanistan's economy, which would create more insurgents. This is, of course, a major exaggeration when it comes to Mexico, where even if the drug trade accounts for $10 billion, it's still less than 1% of Mexico's GDP. And with a population of over 120 million people, it means that their economy would not collapse without the drug trade, probably. One of the biggest reasons you'll hear used to justify US military intervention in Mexico is that the cartel has evolved to use military tactics and equipment. Incredible video footage was released showing narco soldiers dropping bomblets from drones, just like how we've seen in Syria and Ukraine. Cartel evolution into a paramilitary force is like watching a fish crawl out of water and start walking before your very eyes, a true miracle. Going from combat Toyotas to narco tanks. These are essentially garbage trucks with a 50 cal slapped on top. Take note by the fact that you weren't even surprised that they have 50 caliber machine guns. It gets worse.
You get along. It's always good to mount a 50 cal.
Though, the cartels were spotted using more sophisticated narco tanks that looked like they were purpose-built and welded together in a shop with some know-how. The narco tank is a step down from the M1 Abrams, for sure, but it still features some engineering quirks with James Bond-esque style features like the ability to deploy oil slicks and caltrops against unsuspecting pursuers. It even had an electrified grill and battering ram. Dozens of these have been confiscated by the Mexican military. But where did a lot of these cartels learn these military tactics in the first place? Well, a good hard look in the mirror could help answer that. From 1996 to 1999, about 500 Mexican Spec Ops GAF members were trained by the U.S. 7th Special Forces Group in reconnaissance, secure communications, and heavy weapons. Defectors, deserters, and corrupt members of the Mexican GAF Special Forces left to create the Los Zetas cartel. They brought with them all kinds of U.S. Special Operations tactics and procedures, and are specifically known for their brutal, indiscriminate murder, shock, and awe tactics that make other cartels look like they're at a furry convention. Another one of the main arguments for why the U.S. military should directly strike Mexican cartels is that the Mexican military and law enforcement agencies are corrupt, in the cartel pockets, and incapable of handling this situation on their own. Evidence for this corruption can be found in the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies Office unclassified report that covered the October 2022 Mexican intelligence leaks. The anonymous hacker group called Guacamaja hacked the Mexican Ministry of Defense and leaked 6 terabytes worth of data on corruption in the Mexican military, police, and politicians. Fortunately, no one's browser history was revealed. The leaks proved leadership in the Mexican military had knowledge of relationships between authorities and cartels, with links between 20 mayors of the state of Guerrero with drug gangs. The leaks exposed Mexican politicians across the country, from legislators to weaknesses in customs that purposely allow the trafficking of drugs through the 48 different points of entry at the border with the United States. But there's a problem here. The corruption isn't limited to Mexico. This is a human universal. The United States Border Patrol is the biggest target of cartel corruption, where there was a 40% increase in corruption arrests, and there are dozens of open investigations still.
Whoa.
In 1 year alone, the United States FBI had to convict 1,600 federal, state, and local officials, and had approximately 2,500 pending corruption investigations ongoing. One convicted American official took $5 million in bribes from the cartels. In 2008, the United States and Mexico signed an agreement entering into the Meridia Initiative. The initial package included $421 million in foreign military funding to train Mexico's elite special forces inside the United States, and allowed Mexico to buy advanced Black Hawk helicopters and other military technology. Since 2019, though, this initiative has ended. So the Meridia Initiative was also sometimes called Plan Mexico, because the US government was hoping they could replicate the success of declining violence in Colombia, but in Mexico. However, that was not the case, and violence seemed to only increase in response to attempts to shut down the cartels using military violence. So what is the correct role of the United States when it comes to counter-narcotics? The Meridia Initiative, or Plan Mexico, has been seen as a failure. Homicides have risen in Mexico from 8 per 100,000 inhabitants to 23. Strengthening the military and giving them greater capabilities has not been enough. One of the likely reasons Plan Mexico Meridia Initiative failed, while it worked better in places like Colombia, has to do with the level of corruption. The Mexican Federal Police, which was overseen by a possibly corrupt general at the time, received millions of dollars from the Meridia Initiative, which likely kneecapped the effectiveness of this military aid from the United States. So the most cynical way of looking at it would be, the American people's demand for drugs has fueled the growth of a terrorist cartel group in Mexico, which led to the US military aid to stop those cartels. But due to the corruption, that aid went to the cartels themselves and only increased their power, to the point where Mexican and American authorities are too corrupt to defeat them on their own. So the idea of the US military intervening is now being floated. Now that is a series of unfortunate events. Over its 50-year history, the war on drugs has already occurred, total cost of $1 trillion to the US taxpayers, with controversial mixed results. We can trace the roots of US military involvement in police activity to the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which stops the federal military from participating in regular civilian law enforcement. It was enacted in response to abuses from the extensive use of the US Army in civil law enforcement.
Okay, so which removed the military from regular civil law enforcement, was enacted in a response to the abuse resulting from the extensive use of the Army in civil law enforcement during the Civil War and Reconstruction. So keeping military out from civil law or law enforcement. That completely makes sense.
In response to abuses from the extensive use of the U.S. Army and civil law enforcement during the Civil War Reconstruction. But this 1878 Posse Comitatus Act would soon be changed to allow the U.S. military into counter-narcotics.
We're talking about basically halfway to martial law. Basically, you know what I mean with martial law. Basically, that the military becomes the military police. I wouldn't have any problems with this, whatsoever.
Narcotics operations. Here's how it happened. Fast forward to the 1970s, and drug use in America is running rampant. In June 1971, President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one, beginning the infamous war on drugs. We see even the language used implies that this is a war, and a war is fought by soldiers. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, the drug-induced death rate per 100,000 population more than doubled from 2.5 in 1970 to 5.6 in 1979. Despite this renewed effort to combat illicit substances, drug use in the United States rose during the 80s. Thus, in 1981, President Reagan signed the Military Cooperation with Civilian Law Enforcement Agencies Act, which allowed the United States Armed Forces to cooperate with domestic and foreign law enforcement agencies in counter-narcotics operations. This is the bill that modified the Posse Comitatus Act that prevented the military from working with the law enforcement in the past. It gave American law enforcement access to military equipment, which some people saw as vital to combating increasingly better funded and equipped cartels, and other people saw as the militarization of police. However, the Department of Defense has always been hesitant to expand here because they believe they have a lack of funding for yet another mission, and they believe it could at some point negatively impact military readiness if resources are diverted to counter-narcotics missions. For instance, in 1985, the Marine Corps spent about 1,200 hours of mobile ground radar surveillance time on the border. The Air Force flew 1,300 hours of radar surveillance missions with custom personnel. And this contributed to the destruction of 200,000 marijuana plants with a street value of over $260 million. When you see the military support of counter-drug trafficking operations having some success, it's tempting to double down on using this tool to solve the problem. Looking at the history of major authorizations of military force and aid against drug trafficking, we can see why lawmakers are so tempted here. In 1989, Operation Just Cause saw 13,000 American soldiers flown into Panama to remove the dictator Noriega, which resulted in his conviction in the United States. In 1993, Pablo Escobar was hunted down and killed using U.S. military equipment. In the year 2000, President Clinton signed what was called Plan Colombia, which sent $1.3 billion of U.S. aid, much of it military-related, to combat the Colombian drug cartels' left-wing insurgents, and the supplies for cocoa crop eradication. It also permitted 500 United States military personnel to visit the country to help train local forces. Since Plan Colombia began, homicides in Colombia were cut in half, while kidnapping and terrorist attacks declined by 90% at one point. That being said, the plan has come under scrutiny for its military-first approach. During the mid-1990s, the Clinton administration ordered and funded a major cocaine policy study by the Rand Drug Policy Research Institute. The study concluded that $3 billion should be switched from federal and local law enforcement to treatment instead. The report stated that this was the cheapest and most effective way to cut drug use. However, President Clinton's drug czar and his office rejected slashing law enforcement spending. So I think the real question we're trying to answer here is, what is the correct role of the US military in counter-narcotics? Is it just to advise and assist by giving intelligence to the police and law enforcement? Or have conditions changed over the past few decades that call for the US military to directly strike cartels? Whatever solution is found, it will best be done through the Mexican government instead of a unilateral approach. Welcome, you've made it to the Foo Bar and Grill, where average soldiers come to talk about how this mission is up beyond all recognition. You can get your own Foo Bar and Grill t-shirt from the YouTube store below, or join the members only section for exclusive access to monthly videos and members only emojis.
All right, so this is a very sensitive topic. Again, I have no issues if bringing in military for law enforcement if the law enforcement cannot control ever-growing number of crimes, especially when they talk about the heinous crimes, the the murders and the especially murders of innocent people, I have no issues bringing in the military to help out, cleanse them. If I'm going to be completely honest, I know it's the cartel in Mexico is pretty much running most of the country. That's all I have to say about that. And I do understand that bringing them down is probably really bad for even the social economy for Mexico. So I have no clue. I think it's better to contain the drugs in your own country, stricten the borders, and if that doesn't help, fine. Boots on ground might not be a positive thing. Let me know what you think. I'm gonna wrap it up. Thank you so much to Task and Purpose for the amazing video. I was listening, hanging on to every word for 22 minutes and 15 seconds. If you want to check it out, the video and Task and Purpose channel links is available in the description. Go there and give them the support that they so much deserve. Other than that, thank you so much for watching. I'm Recky, and you stay safe.